Get ready to discover facts that no one knows about. I will tell you what medieval people had to do to survive the night. And a medieval night is not just any night. It was a night so cold that your own home felt like an ice cave, and the frost penetrated your bones through the walls. Today we take warmth for granted. One push of a button and the radiators become hot. But for people in the Middle Ages, warmth was not a comfort, but a luxury and the main currency of survival. Watch the video to the end to find out why medieval people never slept alone, how an entire village could fit in one bed, and what the true price of a night in the warmth was in a world bound by ice. What if I told you that everything you believed about medieval homes was untrue? We imagined cozy cottages, but the reality was different. For the vast majority of peasants in the Middle Ages, a home consisted of only one room. This architectural feature was not a choice, but a harsh necessity dictated by economy and, above all, a desperate need for warmth. The entire life of the family, from birth to last breath, took place in this single, shared space, which served as a kitchen, bedroom, living room, and sometimes even a workshop. The very idea of a private room or bedroom was completely foreign to medieval peasant thinking. Privacy was a luxury available only to the highest aristocracy, and even then, in a very limited form. For the common man, the house was a collective shelter. The division of space into functional areas was minimal, if it existed at all. The entire family, including distant relatives or hired workers, if any, existed in one thermal bubble. The design of such dwellings was aimed at retaining any available heat. The walls were most often made of wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and manure. This material was cheap and readily available, but had very poor insulating properties. Cold winds easily penetrated through the cracks, and the walls quickly froze, transferring the icy cold inside the room. Therefore, the only way to keep warm was to gather as close as possible to the source of fire. The roof, covered with straw or reeds, was also a source of constant heat loss. Although a thick layer of straw could serve as a good insulator, it quickly became unusable, began to leak, and required constant repair. Smoke from the hearth, seeking a way out, often found it right through the straw, making the roof vulnerable and creating a constant fire hazard. Nevertheless, this smoky roof was part of the ventilation system, however primitive it may have been. The floor in such a house was simply packed earth. Sometimes it was sprinkled with straw or dry grass to make it a little warmer and cleaner, but the earth still drew cold and dampness. In such conditions, lying directly on the floor was tantamount to slowly freezing to death. This forced people to find any way to rise above the icy surface, which made a shared bed or couch not just a piece of furniture, but a vital tool for survival. The windows, if they could be called that, were another weak point. Glass was unheard of in peasant houses. Instead, the openings were either not made at all or covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or at best, thin plates of horn. Naturally, there was no question of airtightness. The shutters were closed at night, plunging the room into pitch darkness, but drafts still swept through the room. In this single space, there were no corridors or internal partitions that could slow down the movement of cold air. As soon as the only door was opened, an icy whirlwind rushed in, instantly cooling the already cool room. The entire architecture was designed for one purpose: to create a closed space that could be heated in some way by a single source of fire. And that source was the heart of the house. Living in one room meant that all human warmth was concentrated in one place. The bodies of people sleeping side by side became a collective radiator. During the day, people gathered around the fire, and at night, under one shared blanket. It was not just a tradition, but a survival strategy. Separating from the group, attempting to be alone, would have been a sure way to freeze. The social structure itself was dictated by this thermal necessity. The family was a single organism that survived only by sticking together. Physical warmth was inextricably linked to social warmth. Being expelled from the home, from this shared cocoon of warmth, was one of the most terrible punishments. It literally meant being left alone in the freezing cold. Thus, a one-room house was not just a primitive dwelling, but but a complex system of survival. It forced people to be together, erasing the boundaries of personal space and turning the family into a single entity. All further survival strategies, from sleeping together to living with livestock, were merely a consequence of this basic architectural reality. Do you agree with this? Please tell us what you think about this. Every opinion is valuable, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what a medieval fireplace really was? When we hear the word hearth, we imagine a cozy fireplace with a brick chimney. However, in a peasant's house, and indeed in many castles of the early Middle Ages, there was nothing of the sort. The heart of the dwelling was an open hearth, essentially a simple depression in the earthen floor in the center of the room, lined with stones. The fire burned right in the middle of the living space. It was the only place in the house that generated heat. The main problem with such a hearth was the lack of a chimney. Smoke from burning wood or peat filled the entire room before finding a way out. In the best case, there was a special opening in the roof that could be covered during heavy rain. In the worst case, the smoke simply seeped through the thatched roof. As a result, the walls and ceiling were covered with a thick layer of black soot, and the air in the room was heavy and acrid. The fire itself required constant attention and, more importantly, fuel. Providing the house with firewood was one of the main daily tasks. Peasants had the right to collect dead wood in the Lord's forest, but this was often not enough. They had to use anything that could burn: peat, dried manure, heather. Saving fuel was a dire necessity. The fire was never lit just for comfort. In the evening, the fire was not completely extinguished, but buried. This was an important ritual. The coals were covered with ashes so that they could smolder until morning, preserving precious heat. In the morning, they were fanned again, saving time and energy on lighting a new fire. In many European languages, the word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, which literally means cover the fire. It was a signal that it was time to sleep. The location of the hearth in the center of the room was not accidental. This allowed the heat to spread in all directions, and the maximum number of people could gather around it. Those who sat closer to the fire received the bulk of the heat, while the corners of the room remained freezing cold. A peculiar thermal hierarchy emerged. The most honorable and warmest place by the fire went to the head of the family or an important guest. However, the efficiency of such heating was extremely low. Most of the hot air, along with the smoke, rose and escaped outside. Stone or clay walls did not accumulate heat. On the contrary, they actively absorbed it and released it outside. As soon as the fire died down, the room cooled down almost instantly. This meant that the heat from the hearth was only available when it was actively burning. The constant struggle with smoke was an inevitable price to pay for warmth. People who spent their entire lives in such conditions often had problems with their lungs and eyesight, but there was no alternative. Cold was a more immediate and deadly threat than smoke. People were willing to put up with soot and suffocating air for the sake of a few degrees of warmth that separated them from death. Fire was not only a source of life, but also a constant threat. Sparks flying from an open hearth could set fire to a thatched roof or dry wooden structures at any moment. Fires were a frequent and devastating disaster in medieval settlements. People lived in constant fear of fire, on which their lives depended. It was a paradox of survival. What warmed them could also destroy them. The entire system of medieval life was built around this imperfect, smoky, and dangerous source of heat. It dictated the daily routine. People got up at dawn and went to bed as soon as they buried the fire. But even the hottest hearth could not warm an icy house at night. And this is where the next most important survival strategy came into play. What if I told you that the bed was not a place of privacy, but the most densely populated object in the house? Read on to the next chapter to learn the secret of the great bed. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the medieval bedroom. In that one room where the hearth burned, stood the most important piece of furniture in the entire house: the bed. But it was not the bed we are used to. It was the great bed, a massive wooden structure large enough to accommodate the entire family, and sometimes more. In an era when personal space was an abstraction, sleeping together was the absolute norm. It was dictated not only by social norms, but also by basic thermodynamics. Several human bodies under one blanket generate significantly more heat than one. In a cold, frozen room where the temperature at night could drop to almost the same as outside, this was the only way not to freeze. The bed itself was a simple wooden frame. Instead of a modern mattress, a net made of ropes or leather straps was stretched over the frame. On top of this net, a mattress called a palliasse was placed. It was simply a large bag made of coarse fabric, stuffed with straw, dry leaves, or horsehair. The straw quickly became matted and had to be changed regularly, but it was better than sleeping on bare boards. Sheets were laid on top of the straw mattress, if the family could afford them, and heavy blankets were used for covering. The blankets were made of coarse, undyed wool. They were prickly and heavy, but very warm. The wealthier the family, the more blankets they had. Sometimes furs or even outer clothing were used as additional insulation, simply thrown over the sleepers. Everyone slept together in this bed. The head of the family, his wife, and their relatives who lived with them. The order in which they lay down often followed a strict hierarchy. The warmest and safest place, by the wall, was usually reserved for the elderly or women. The man as the protector often slept on the edge. Sleeping on the edge was not only colder, but also more dangerous, given the turbulent times. If there was not enough room in the main bed, additional sleeping places were used. So-called trundle beds were common. These were low beds on wheels that were pushed under the high, great bed during the day to save space and pulled out at night. Older family members, or servants if there were any, could sleep on them. Often people did not sleep completely undressed, as we are accustomed to. They remained in their undergarments, a long linen shirt or nightgown. This was dictated not so much by modesty as by practicality. First, it was an extra layer of clothing that retained heat. Second, in a house where there was no privacy, it was simply necessary. It was easier to get up at night to relieve oneself or in case of an emergency when wearing at least minimal clothing. Sleeping together was the norm not only for the poor. In castles and wealthy homes, servants often slept right in their master's room, on the floor next to his bed. This was done for security reasons and so that they would be close at hand, but also because the master's room was one of the few that was heated. The servants' bodies also contributed to the overall heating of the room. This custom of communal sleeping was so ingrained that no one thought twice about it. It did not carry the intimate connotations that we attach to the concept today. It was a purely utilitarian practice. People were much less squeamish and much more tolerant of physical closeness than we are in our age of individualism. The great bed was, therefore, not just a piece of furniture. It was a social institution, the center of family life, and the main stronghold in the daily battle against the cold. It was an ark in which the family waited out the long and icy medieval nights. If you found this unique aspect of medieval life interesting, please like this video. And if you want to know more about life in medieval castles, subscribe to the channel. You'll learn even more incredible facts about history. What I am about to tell you may seem wild, but in the Middle Ages, it was a common practice of hospitality. What happened when a guest or traveler came to a house? In a world without hotels and guest rooms, the answer was simple. They were put to bed with everyone else. Refusing to give a guest a place in the shared bed was considered the height of inhospitableness and could be taken as an insult. For medieval people, the idea of sleeping in the same bed with a stranger was not shocking. It was the norm, especially for those who traveled. Inns, which were just beginning to appear, offered not rooms but a place in a common hall. This hall could contain several huge beds, each of which could sleep 5, 10, or even more people who did not know each other. There were certain rules and etiquette for sleeping together. Travelers often slept without removing their outer clothing, or at least remained in their underwear. Weapons were placed next to them under a pillow or blanket. The arrangement in bed depended on who arrived when. A newly arrived guest would lie down at the edge, trying not to disturb those who were already asleep. Sometimes, for the sake of propriety, strangers in the same bed could be separated. A pillow, rolled-up blanket, or even a simple wooden board placed in the middle was used as a barrier. This practice, known as bundling, allowed people to share physical warmth without violating social norms. Although, of course, in a crowded-in bed, such subtleties were often forgotten. This custom was based on pure pragmatism. The inn earned its money not from rooms but from bed spaces. The more people they could accommodate, the higher their income. And for a traveler, frozen after a long day in the saddle, a hot dinner and a warm place to sleep, even if it was next to a stranger, were the greatest blessing. The warmth of human bodies was as much a part of the payment for lodging as the roof over one's head. Even in wealthy homes and castles, guests were not always given a separate room. Often, a distinguished guest would be put to bed in the same bed as the host or his son. This was considered a sign of special respect and trust. They shared not only a bed, but also warmth, which symbolically strengthened their bond. Meanwhile, the guest servants slept huddled together with the host servants on the floor in the same room. Of course, there were alternatives. The poorest travelers, pilgrims, or vagabonds who could not even afford a place in a shared bed slept on the floor. They lay down on straw or reed mats as close as possible to the dying fire in the common room of the tavern. It was cold and uncomfortable, but still better than staying on the street, where the night frost could be deadly. This total lack of privacy shaped a completely different attitude toward the body and space. People were accustomed to each other's smells, sounds, and touch. What seems to us an unthinkable violation of personal boundaries was simply everyday life for them, part of their collective existence. They were forced to trust each other, at least while they slept. The practice of sleeping together with strangers began to disappear only in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. With the growth of prosperity and the emergence of a new class, the bourgeoisie, it was they who began to demand individual rooms and separate beds, seeing this as a sign of status. But for peasant Europe, this transformation took several more centuries. Thus, the medieval bed was not just a place to sleep, but a complex social space. It was a microcosm that reflected hierarchy, social connections, and above all, a desperate, all-consuming need for warmth. How much do you think our society has changed since sleep became a private matter? In the next chapter, we will discuss a strategy that seems unthinkable today: how people use their pets as hot water bottles. The survival strategy we are about to discuss may seem most surprising to modern people. It involves the deliberate cohabitation of humans and their most valuable possessions, livestock, under one roof. This was a common practice in many regions of Northern Europe, and its main purpose was not only to protect the animals, but also to use them to heat the home. This concept found its architectural embodiment in the so-called longhouse, or byre dwelling. Such a structure was a single long building divided into two parts. People lived in one part, usually raised a few steps. The other, lower part housed a stall for cows, sheep, or goats. Often there was no clear wall between the two halves, only a light wooden partition or simply a curtain. The economic logic was obvious. Livestock was the main capital of a peasant family. Losing a cow due to cold weather or theft was tantamount to ruin. Keeping animals inside the house was the most reliable way to protect them. But this practice also had a huge vital side effect: warmth. A large animal such as a cow gives off a tremendous amount of heat. The heat generated by the bodies of several animals was constant and significant. It rose upward and helped heat the living area of the house, which was located nearby. It was a stable, round-the-clock source of heat that did not require firewood and did not produce smoke. For a peasant family, this was a real gift, allowing them to save precious fuel and maintain a more or less tolerable temperature in the house. Of course, such cohabitation had obvious disadvantages, primarily related to hygiene. Odors and fumes from the stable freely penetrated the living quarters. However, we must remember that medieval standards of cleanliness were completely different. In a world where personal hygiene was difficult and the streets were dirty, animal odors were not perceived as unbearable. The location of the living area above the stalls was also no accident. Not only did this allow heat to rise to the people, but it also solved the problem of animal waste accumulating in the lower part. This two-level system was the pinnacle of pragmatic peasant engineering, solving several survival problems at once. This practice was especially common in harsher climates, such as Scandinavia, Scotland, and the mountainous regions of Germany. Where winters were particularly long and cold, and fuel was scarce, the heat from livestock was not just a bonus, but a critical component of survival. Archaeological excavations of such longhouses clearly show the division between living and livestock areas. What if everything you were taught about medieval fashion was not about beauty, but about survival? We often forget that clothing is our first and most important line of defense against the cold. For medieval people living in constantly cold houses, clothing was not just a way to cover the body, but a personal heating system that they wore around the clock. And the main strategy here was layering. The basis of any person's wardrobe, from peasant to king, was an undergarment or camisole. It was made of linen. Linen was relatively cheap to produce and, more importantly, absorbed sweat well and was easy to wash, unlike woolen outerwear. This linen layer was important for hygiene and comfort, protecting the skin from rough wool. Wool was the main insulator. It was truly the miracle fabric of the Middle Ages. Wool has the unique ability to retain heat even when wet. In conditions of constant dampness, when clothes could get wet from rain, snow, or simply evaporation in the house, this property was invaluable. One or more woolen tunics, known as kata or kirtle, were worn over a linen shirt. The colder it got, the more layers a person wore. A surcoat, another, often looser outer garment, could be worn over the tunic. In winter, this layer cake was topped with a heavy woolen cloak or mantle. Cloaks were long, often reaching to the feet, and could be lined with fur for extra warmth if one could afford it. Particular attention was paid to protecting the head, hands, and feet. A huge amount of heat escapes through the head, and medieval people understood this perfectly well. They almost never went bareheaded, even indoors. Men wore felt hats or linen caps, coifs, and over them hoods, which were very popular because they covered not only the head but also the neck and shoulders. They wore woolen or leather mittens on their hands and woolen stockings or shoes on their feet. Their footwear was simple: leather boots with soft soles that quickly became wet. To protect their feet from the cold and dampness of the earthen floor, they stuffed straw or dry moss into their boots as makeshift insoles. To walk on muddy ground, they used wooden platform sandals called pattens. It is important to understand that these clothes were practically never taken off. At night, when going to bed in a communal bed, people only took off the top, dirty layer and their shoes. They slept in the same linen shirts they wore during the day. This not only saved energy, but also allowed them to retain body heat even while sleeping. In the morning, they simply put the top layers back on. Caring for clothes was difficult. Woolen clothes were not washed but cleaned and aired. Washing could lead to shrinkage and damage to expensive fabrics. This meant that the clothes absorbed all the smells of the house: smoke from the hearth, the smells of food. But in the context of survival, these were minor issues. The main thing was that the clothes served their purpose. They were a personal, wearable fortress against the cold. For a person on the road, the medieval winter was doubly dangerous. A traveler caught in a blizzard, or simply in twilight far from home, risked not only catching a cold, but not living to see the morning. Therefore, finding a place to stay for the night was the main task of any traveler. And this lodging was almost always communal. Individual rooms, as we understand them today, simply did not exist. The most common place to stay overnight was an inn or tavern. The center of such an establishment was the common room. It was a large room with a huge hearth, which the owner tried to keep burning to attract customers. Travelers coming in from the cold rushed to this fire first thing. Here they had dinner, drank ale, and exchanged news, sharing the warmth of the hearth with each other. When it was time to sleep, there were few options. The most expensive and comfortable was a place in one of the common beds, which we have already mentioned. Travelers paid for the right to sleep under a blanket, sharing it with several strangers. It was expensive but warm and relatively safe. The tavern owner kept a close eye on his beds to make sure there were no problems. Those who could not afford a place in a bed slept right in the common room. They spread their cloaks on the floor or on benches, trying to get as close as possible to the dying fire. The floor was strewn with straw, which served as a primitive mattress and provided some insulation from the cold ground. It was noisy, uncomfortable, and not very warm, but it was a roof over their heads. Another important refuge for travelers were monasteries. The church considered hospitality to be one of the main virtues. Many monasteries, especially those located on busy pilgrimage routes, had special guest houses or hospices. Here, pilgrims and other travelers could get free, albeit very modest, lodging and food. In monastic hospices, travelers were usually accommodated in large communal bedrooms called dormitories. These were long halls lined with rows of simple wooden beds or just mattresses on the floor. The monks provided travelers with blankets and kept the fire burning in the hearth, if there was one. The warmth here was also collective, and the physical proximity of dozens of people in one room helped to maintain the temperature. The rules in such shelters were strict. Travelers had to remain silent, pray with the monks, and leave the shelter at dawn. But for warmth and safety, people were willing to put up with any rules. The monastery was an island of order and civilization in a chaotic and dangerous world. For the poorest and most infirm, there were also city hospitals, which in the Middle Ages were more like shelters than medical facilities. They were also often run by monastic orders. Here, the sick, crippled, and destitute could find refuge from the cold. They slept on shared bunks, often 2 or 3 to a bed, sharing what little warmth there was. It may seem that in medieval cities, the problem of cold was not as acute as in the countryside. This was partly true, but it was achieved not through technology, but through density. Cities were surrounded by walls, and the space inside them was incredibly valuable. This led to very dense construction, which had an unexpected thermal effect. Houses in cities were built close to each other. A shared wall with a neighbor meant that at least one wall of your house did not face the icy street, but was in contact with a heated room. It was a passive but very effective form of insulation. Entire neighborhoods were a single array of buildings that retained heat better than detached village huts. Townhouses were often narrow but tall, with several floors. They were built using frame technology, where wooden beams formed the supporting structure, and the gaps were filled with the same clay and straw. A characteristic feature was the overhanging structure, or jet toy, where each subsequent floor protruded slightly above the previous one. This protected the lower floors from rain, but also made the streets very narrow. In some cities, such as the famous Shambles district in York, the upper floors of houses on opposite sides of the street almost touched. This created a tunnel effect, which on the one hand, plunged the street into semi-darkness, but on the other hand, protected it from the wind. The urban environment itself was more protected from the elements than the open countryside. Craft workshops were an important source of heat in the city. Smithies, bakeries, glassworks, and potteries all required constant fire. Furnaces and forges worked all day long, giving off a ton of heat. This heat warmed not only the workshop itself, but also the living quarters, which were often located on the second floor of the same building. This was a great advantage for apprentices and journeymen who lived and worked in the master's house. They often slept right in the workshop or in the attic, in the warmth emanating from the stove as it cooled down overnight. This was much more comfortable than sleeping in an unheated room. The master thus provided his workers not only with shelter and food, but also with warmth. However, this density had a deadly downside: fire. In cities built almost entirely of wood, with thatched and shingle roofs, where every house had an open hearth, fires were a disaster. A single spark could destroy an entire neighborhood in a matter of hours. The famous Great Fires were the scourge of medieval cities. For the poor urban population, life was no easier than in the countryside. They huddled in overcrowded apartment buildings, tents, often in tiny rooms in attics or basements. These rooms might not have had their own hearth, and people depended on the heat coming from their neighbors or warmed themselves with braziers with coals, which was extremely dangerous due to the risk of poisoning. Urban heat was more concentrated, but it was distributed unevenly. Wealthy merchants built spacious houses with several fireplaces, while the poor froze in their shacks. However, even a wealthy townsman would not have thought of heating the entire house. The heat was concentrated in 1 or 2 rooms, usually the main hall and the kitchen. Thus, the city offered a different model of survival. Here, heat was shared not only by family members, but also by neighbors, through shared walls and entire professional guilds, through the warmth of craft workshops. Population density was both a salvation from the cold and a factor of incredible risk. The city was a collective cauldron where everyone was cooked in the same broth, sharing warmth, smells, and danger with each other. There is a common myth that medieval lords and ladies lived in warmth and luxury. The reality was shockingly different. A stone castle, a symbol of power and wealth, was a disaster in terms of heating. Stone has high thermal conductivity and enormous heat capacity. This means that it not only quickly lets the cold in, but also actively absorbs any heat, remaining ice cold to the touch. The walls of castles were several meters thick, but this was done for defense, not for insulation. In winter, these massive stone blocks froze through. Huge halls, high ceilings, and stone floors turned the castle into a giant refrigerator. It was almost impossible to heat such a space. The people who lived in castles suffered from the cold, perhaps even more than the peasants in their low, smoky huts. The main technological breakthrough in castles was the fireplace with a chimney built into the wall. Unlike an open hearth, it allowed smoke to be effectively removed. But this had a consequence. The fireplace acted like a pump, drawing warm air out of the room and sucking in icy air from all the cracks. The level of comfort provided by such a fireplace was questionable. Your face burned from the heat, while your back froze from the draft. The aristocracy combated this cold with textiles. This is precisely why the famous tapestries and wall hangings were invented. These heavy woven carpets were hung on cold stone walls. They served not only as decoration, but also as an important insulating material. They created an air gap between the icy wall and the room, blocking drafts and retaining heat. Floors were also a problem. Stone slabs were unbearably cold. To insulate them, floors were covered with a thick layer of straw or dry grass, such as reeds. This layer was not changed as often as one would like, but it was vital. In wealthier homes, expensive carpets imported from the East and valued at their weight in gold were laid on top of the straw. The center of life in the castle was the Great Hall. It was the largest and most heated room with the largest fireplace. Here the lord and his household ate, received guests, and conducted business. All life in the castle was concentrated in this one warm room. At night, the hall was turned into a common bedroom for servants, guards, and guests, who slept on benches or on the floor by the fire. The lord and his family had separate quarters, known as the solar. This was a private room, usually located above the Great Hall, and often facing south to catch the sparse winter sun. It had its own smaller fireplace. This room was the warmest in the entire castle, and access to it was strictly limited. Even in the solar, the main defense against the cold was the bed. The aristocrat's bed became a veritable architectural structure. It was a four-poster bed. It not only had a roof, but also heavy velvet or woolen curtains on all sides. At night, these canopies were drawn, creating a small, warm room within a room, where the warmth of sleeping bodies was retained until morning. Even a lord rarely slept alone. There were always servants in his bedroom. A valet or squire could sleep on a rollaway bed at his master's feet. This was done for security and so that the servant was available at any moment. But it also meant that there were more warm bodies in the room. The privacy of sleep was still relative. Thus, the life of an aristocrat was a constant battle for degrees. Their wealth allowed them to burn more wood, have more furs and textiles, but it could not defeat the fundamental laws of physics. Their stone fortresses were traps of cold. Survival in a castle, as in a hut, required concentrating heat in one place and sharing it. For centuries, the survival strategies we have described remained virtually unchanged. Sleeping together, living side by side with livestock, concentrating the whole family around a single hearth. All this was the unshakable foundation of everyday life. People were born and died in this collective thermal cocoon. However, in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, slow but irreversible changes began to take place, which ultimately led to our modern concept of comfort. One of the main technological drivers was the improvement of the fireplace. The advent of efficient chimneys and fireboxes made it possible to build fireplaces not only in the main halls, but also in other rooms. Fire became safer and less smoky. Although fireplaces were still inefficient, the very possibility of having multiple heat sources in the house changed everything. Architecture changed in parallel. Corridors began to appear in the homes of wealthy townspeople and aristocrats. This simple invention was revolutionary. Previously, to get from one room to another, you had to pass through all the previous ones. Now the rooms became isolated and could be accessed from a common corridor. This was the first step towards creating personal space. Glass, although still expensive, was becoming more affordable. Windows that could be closed without plunging the room into darkness were a huge step forward. They reduced drafts and allowed for better heat retention. The house ceased to be a semi-open structure exposed to the elements and became more airtight. Along with technology, human consciousness also changed. The ideas of humanism and the Renaissance brought the value of the individual and personality to the forefront. A new concept emerged: privacy. Wealthy people began to value solitude. They no longer wanted to share their bedrooms with servants or their beds with guests. The house began to be divided into functional areas, common and private. The great bed began to lose its social function. It ceased to be a public center and became a purely personal, intimate space. First, guests and distant relatives were evicted from it, then servants. Eventually, it became a place of sleep only for married couples. This was a tectonic shift in public consciousness. The same thing happened with the separation from the animal world. Increased prosperity and new ideas about hygiene led to livestock being permanently evicted to separate buildings, barns and sheds. The idea of sharing a roof with a cow began to seem wild and unacceptable. People separated their homes from their farms. This process was, of course, very long and uneven. In villages and among the poor, the old ways persisted for hundreds of years. But the trend was set. Heat ceased to be a collective resource that everyone had to fight for together. It became an individual comfort that could be bought. We can see how deeply the need for warmth shaped medieval society. It dictated architecture, social hierarchy, family relationships, and even etiquette. People were forced to stick together to survive. They shared the warmth of their bodies, their hearths, and their animals with each other, creating a close-knit, physically intimate community. Today, with heating at the click of a button, we rarely think about the fact that warmth was once the greatest luxury. Our privacy, our separate rooms and beds, all of this became possible only when humans learned to efficiently generate and retain heat. The era of collective survival is gone, giving way to an era of individual comfort. Studying these ancient practices reminds us of how dependent we are on technology, but it also shows the incredible adaptability of humans and the power of community. In the cold of the Middle Ages, people did not survive alone, but only together, turning warmth into their main social bond. We have come a long way, from smoky peasant huts to cold stone halls of castles. We have seen that survival in the Middle Ages was a daily, collective struggle. Warmth was a primary value, and to preserve it, people shared everything: their homes, their beds, and even their space with their livestock. These strategies, sleeping together, one-room dwellings, living around an open hearth, were not a whim, but a necessity of life. They shaped a society where privacy was an unaffordable luxury, and survival was only possible shoulder to shoulder. Today's comforts were built on this centuries-old experience of collective struggle against the cold. What other aspects of medieval life would you like us to cover? Perhaps you are interested in how they stored food without refrigerators, or how medieval medicine worked. Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the past.